I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Brittany Rogers. I'm with New York Sea Grant, and I'm the host of the webinar series. So again, welcome and thank you for joining us this morning. So right now, I do have everybody muted to avoid any background noises that would distract the presentation. We will address all of the questions that get put into the chat box at the end of the session during a Q&A portion of today's presentation. So now I'll just give you a little bit more of a background and introduction into our presenters, and I will let them take the floor. So today's session is the first of many, and our topic is watercraft inspection legislation and regulations. And so our two presenters are Kathy McGlynn and Matt Brincka. So Kathy is the Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. She is responsible for coordinating the implementation of the statewide AIS management plan, expansion of the boat steward programs, and the standardization of messaging and data management throughout the state is all done through that. And also we have Matt Brincka, who is with the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, and he is the Ocean and Great Lakes Educator. Part of his duties do include coordinating the agency's watercraft inspection program, which ranges all the way from the western end of New York State and Lake Erie, and all the way over to Albany in the eastern end of the state. And so they have a pretty broad coverage for that program. And so with that, again, I'd just like to remind everybody that we do have you muted, but if you'd like to submit questions, put them in the chat box and we'll get to those at the end. And so thank you, Kathy and Matt, for joining us, and I'm gonna let you go ahead and take over.
All right, so I can just share. All right, thanks for the introduction, Brittany. We're gonna talk about regulations, which is a highly exciting topic, but it is a necessary one. So hopefully you can hear us okay. We're gonna first start with me for a little bit, and then I'll pass it off to Kathy, and then we have some an FAQ that at the end that answers a lot of questions, and then we will open it up to more. So, first thing is just talking about New York's updated Aquatic Invasive Species Management Plan. So we'll go in a little bit more in depth about those updates, but it was released back in July 15th of 2015. And the huge part about it is it emphasizes prevention and early detection of those aquatic invasive species. And one of the top priorities within that is the expansion of boat steward coverage across New York State. So boat stewards, it is a form of prevention. And there is a spectrum of responses that we have with prevention. Some of those are regulatory, and some of those are voluntary. So why do we emphasis on prevention? And with any invasive species, prevention is really the best method of dealing with them. For one, it avoids any major ecological impacts, because typically, when we look at this invasion curve over here on the right, the point of introduction is typically not the point of when it's actually found. Normally, you don't find an invasive species infestation until later on, and sometimes it's then too late. So prevention is the main way that we can avoid those ecological impacts. Another big thing is, especially for all of us, is the economic impacts as well. But not only economic impacts on the cost of containment, because as soon as we jump up from prevention to eradication to containment, those costs continually expand and get more and more expensive, because to contain a population on a smaller area is more expensive than preventing on a larger area. But also the economic impacts that some invasive species have on like property values and other things as well, which are sometimes the undercover, the hidden economic impacts that we don't think about a lot. However, prevention is not 100% foolproof. So with boat steward programs, for example, sometimes you just can't find everything that's on a boat. It's suggested that it's sometimes 88% effective, plus or minus 5%, but it's a good start. So one of the major vectors for aquatic invasive species transport is introduction. And introduction is through recreational watercraft users. And that can be anything from your canoe and kayak to your fishing boats, your motorboats, or your PWCs. Each one is a little bit different in their methods of transportation, but they're all culprits, especially those with some type of proper motor that are trailered where plants can get pinched, or if they have bilges or live walls where soft-bodied organisms can get in. So state legislation was passed. Senator O'Mara and Assemblymember Lifton introduced some legislation to prevent the spread of AIS by recreational boaters. And then Cuomo signed that legislation into law back in September of 2014. So from that law, DEC and Parks drafted regulations to help actually enforce those. So we have, well, I guess Amendment Article 3, is that part of DC? Okay. So Amendment Article 3 specifically is with navigational law, and AIS, and specifically it says AIS spread prevention signs at public boat launches. So that's where you see the DEC and the park signs with an example on the right. And I don't think I've ever gone really anywhere in the state where I haven't seen some type of signage. And DEC and then Parks also put together two parts regulations. For DEC, it's NYCRR Part 59.4, and for Parks, it's 377.1. Parks regulations are based on DEC's regulations. So within those regulations, it says AIS spread prevention and regulations for boat launching and retrieving at DEC and park-owned sites. So if the site is owned by DEC or OPRHP, boaters are required to do some type of AIS spread prevention through inspections, draining of water, those types of things we'll talk about in a moment, whether they are launching or retrieving. So that's important to label. And that includes properties that, like, for example, OPRHP owns but currently does not manage. So OPRHP does own boat launches across the state where local municipalities do the actual management of those launches. So those regulations would still be part of that launch. So getting a little bit more in what we mean about AIS prevention. So clean basically means inspecting your watercraft, anchor equipment, gear, trailer, floating docks, and removing any plant or animal matter from that. And then dispose of those materials in appropriate receptacle, so those AIS disposal stations, or upland away from any type of mean high water mark. So here are some pictures you can see of our wonderful disposal stations, and the one on the left is actually very well installed. I do want to pull out, or just briefly mention and say, we do sometimes see, especially like at some municipality launches that are trying to install the stations, or even sometimes at some park launches, of the stations being installed incorrectly. So it's important to notice that the disposal station is flush with the ground. It has some gravel where water can drain through. It's properly labeled. It's not on like concrete where if you drop something in, it can just be washed out with water. And then here's some signage as well. Drain. Draining means the removal of the water from the watercraft or water holding compartments away from the water body before launching. So this is important. It does not just mean pulling your bilge plug. It means draining out the water in your live well and bait buckets, and so on. Draining water from cooling systems of personal watercraft after leaving the water at a distance away from the water as well. So treating, what we mean by this is essentially drying via heat or sun exposure up to 5 days or 4 or 5 days, or sub-freezing temperatures for 3 days, so like in the middle of winter, or towel drying portions of that boat and equipment prior to launching. So it's one or the other. Both would be great, because sometimes it does take a little bit longer to dry than 5 days if you have a boat that it was cloudy for a day or so on and so forth. The other part of treating is also rinsing. And this is really targeted towards our soft-bodied organisms, using a high-pressure hot water or on the exterior, and rinsing and flushing the motor for at least 2 minutes, and rinsing water-containing compartments with hot water for about 30 seconds. And that's really, like I said, it helps with the soft-body organisms that we typically cannot see. So your veligers for your zebra mussels and your Asian clams, or your spiny water fleas, and so on and so forth. It also really helps with the application of any type of maintenance or anti-foul, or putting on anti-fouling paint as well, to prevent any type of stickage, I guess you could call it, especially for those boats who remain in the water for an extended period of time in the summer. You're more likely to have those zebra mussel veligers, or even small zebra mussels becoming attached to your boat. So just this past year, Parks updated its wording for its regulations, mainly because we saw we realized that our regulations opened up the ability for individuals to drain their water at the launch before entering the water body. And what I mean by at the launch, I mean they are ready to go 2 feet away from the launch, on the launch itself, and they pop their bilge truck or their bilge plug from wherever they were before and drain all the water directly into the lake, which we do not want. So we reworded it to make sure that it says that that water needs to be drained away from the launch and above any type of high water mark, and preferably before a vehicle even enters the park. Preferably pop it when you're coming out of the water, because you don't want that water sitting around in your boat anyways. And on the right, you can see this is our standardized signs for OPRHP launches, where it goes into a little bit about clean, drain, and dry. OPRHP does provide these signs as a PDF form to individuals who want to do a printing of their own. I know some launches down on the Hudson use them. We cannot provide physical signs though, so any type of printing and making would have to be done by the organization. And oh, this is DEC's, right? My fault. So DEC's regulation also highly recommends focusing on flushing the bilge and other water-containing compartments before entering the water body, and that's exactly the same as Parks. So like I said before, Parks regulation ultimately mirrored DEC regulations, so if you're going to some type of state-owned launch, you're following the same regulations no matter where you are.
Okay. So now I'll be talking about Part 576, which is recent regulations passed in May of last year regarding taking reasonable precautions to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species. So 576 focuses on cleaning, draining, and drying, and treating, which matches details, so that according to this particular regulation, those methods need to be used before launching a watercraft in any public water body. Environmental conservation officers have discretionary authority to enforce this regulation. And watercraft and floating docks are exempt when they are relaunched from the same water body without having been launched in any other water body. Some other exemptions include plants, not invasive plants, that are used for camouflage, for hunting, or wildlife viewing purposes that are placed on a boat or trailer or other floating vehicle, as illustrated in this image on the right. Bait fish and game fish that are possessed and or taken in accordance with applicable laws and regulations. Happy to provide more information if folks want to know more about that. And non-invasive plants used for habitat restoration purposes. Again, they must be approved by DEC prior to installation. The additional exemption would be for folks who are transporting a watercraft that may have AIS to an on-land location for storage. And again, that harkens back to the recommendation for drying in the heated or sun-exposed location or at sub-freezing temperatures for more than 3 to 5 days. So that would likely happen in a storage location as well. Transport of a watercraft to a cleaning or repair facility. There are a number of folks who, when they remove their boats for the winter or their equipment for the winter from the water, will take them to a marina or marine facility to have them cleaned and then stored. And finally, transport of legally caught bass or other fish kept in watercraft's live well to a weigh-in station during tournaments. Okay, additional details. Even though the Part 576 states that cleaning, draining, and treating must take place prior to launching, we are also encouraging that same methodology be used when exiting water bodies that have small-bodied AIS, such as zebra and quagga mussels, Asian clams, spiny, and fishhook water flea. And a lot of folks have questions about, does this regulation apply to my water body? And I'm providing you with the definition of public waters, and I'll repeat this at the end as well. So by definition of this regulation, waters or waters of the state shall be construed to include lakes, bays, sounds, ponds, impounding reservoirs, springs, wells, rivers, streams, creeks, estuaries, marshes, inlets, canals, the Atlantic Ocean within the territorial limits of the state of New York, and all other bodies of surface or underground water, natural or artificial, inlet or coastal, fresh or salt, public or private, except those private waters which do not combine or effect a junction with natural surface or underground waters, which are wholly or partially within or bordering the state or within its jurisdiction. And our joke about this, in the shorthand term, is if you're launching your boat, unless you're launching your boat in your bathtub or your swimming pool, it probably applies to you. So next part again, cleaning, draining, and treating can be done before heading to a launch, and we're encouraging people to do this. We would like to see behavioral change and people getting into the habit of being prepared before they arrive at a launch, and to be aware of these issues and take the time and effort to remain aware and up to date about what's going on. So taking those similar precautions again when exiting a launch is also encouraged. And we had said this before, NCON officers again have the discretionary authority to enforce this law. So details, if a floating dock is delivered to a location and it appears to be carrying invasive species, please report this to your ECO and do not install this dock. Be sure to clean and inspect your dock if you are moving it between water bodies. We've had several reports of this occurring where people are renting floating docks in a particular marina or company, and the dock arrives and it has zebra mussels on it. So please be aware to inspect those structures before you install them. Part 576 applies to all motorized water vehicles, including motorboats and jet skis, and it also applies to non-motorized vehicles, such as canoes, kayaks, as well as rowboats and paddleboards. As you see to the right, we have signage for remote locations, which are mostly used by such non-motorized vehicles. So we want people to be aware that they need to clean, drain, and dry those vehicles as well, even though they don't have, for the most part, water-containing compartments such as bilges or live wells. In addition, we have some questions about this the last time we gave this presentation at NYCRR about float planes. Float planes are considered transporters of AIS. So they are under this regulation. They're covered under this regulation. So I'm providing more detail about that because it's not really spelled out in detail in the regulation. We've had several questions. So potential threats from float planes, including they're flying long distances, which means they have the ability to transport AIS very quickly, very far. Their travel times are short, which would allow the organisms to survive that transport, and they can reach reach very remote locations. So they can be quite a threat in that regard. Best management practices for float planes. We're encouraging pilots to learn more about aquatic invasive species, what to look for and how to report them. Before entering a watercraft, we encourage folks to inspect and remove plants from floats, wires, cables, and rudders. Check the transom, the bottom chine, wheel wells, and float step areas, as well as pumping water from the floats. Before takeoff, do not taxi through heavy aquatic plant growth prior to takeoff. Raise and lower water rudders to clear off plants, minimize cable stretch, and improve steering effectiveness. After takeoff, raise and lower those water rudders several times to free aquatic plant fragments while over the water you are leaving or over land. So Matt will now go on to talk more about the Boat Steward program, which is a major part of providing information about Part 576.
So what most people are probably interested in as boat steward programs, and they're all over the state. And the big part about boat steward programs is it does raise public awareness about AIS, Part 76, and all of our other regulations that we have at our boat launches as well. So the 377.1 and the, what is it, 59.4, all these numbers. But so that is part of it. And as we know with public education and having somebody there at the launch is constantly reminding somebody, it is a norm changer. It reinforces behavioral change. And that is what we're really and that's what we're striving for in New York, is providing that ability for the public to become aware and always informed on it constantly, to reinforce that this is the behavior that they need to take. And it also fosters a real sense of stewardship among recreationalists. They rely on these water bodies to go in for recreation, to enjoy, for fishing. They really rely on these. And if they're destroyed because of invasive species, they need, once they're aware of those consequences, they become better stewards. So, what do boat stewards need to know about launch regulations? All of it, really. But the boat steward's role is education. Our boat stewards are not enforcement. They aren't able to provide tickets. They are really a non-regulatory force. And that is shown in public research and in behavioral research, that an individual will be more open to accepting a change if it's not typically a regulation force. Now, you do have to have regulations as part of it, but it is really a two-headed monster. You need that education outreach and that soft approach, and then you also need that regulation approach. And separating those two identities is important. They also are trained in confrontation avoidance because we don't want to label them as some type of regulation force. So for the state, for New York State Parks, our stewards do not record and they do not report license plate numbers. They will refer, I'm jumping down to the bottom, they will talk to ECO and park police of repeated violations at launches to increase patrols in that area to try to catch offenders, but they do not specifically write down those license plate numbers. They provide regulation documents or RAC cards to them that outline the regulations on what boaters should be doing. And they also provide transportation permits when needed. So penalties for violating Part 576. First violation is a written warning and educational materials. Second violation is a fine up to $150. The third violation is fine up to $300, and then the fourth is fine up to $1,000. So like I said, boat stewards' roles are definitely doing the inspections at the launches and interacting with the boaters at the launches, but they have a role as well away from launches. And it's a way that we can get individuals education who might not go to a launch that has a boat steward manning it. So a big way that we can do that is providing education and outreach away from launches, because how else are you going to find those individual boaters who might not go to an atypical hard top launch who might be going to little kayak launches to launch their kayak, but they don't drain their boat before then, or before they move to another water body. So you can do that at farmers markets, we go to the state fair, to other education outreach opportunities to find those individuals. Another way is our stewards, and I know some other stewards across the state, they also participate in Conservation Corps project, where they actually get to put their hands in doing something a little bit more than invasive species prevention at the launches. They actually get to go out into the field and actually remove invasive species as well. And then I think it's very important to not just provide an initial wave of training for your boat stewards at the beginning, saying, hey, this is what you do, remove plants, provide some education, and so on and so forth. These stewards will receive a barrage of questions at launches. And it's really important to provide training, not just at the beginning, but throughout their stay, to help them increase their knowledge on AIS topics. There's only so much that you can cover in a certain amount of time during the training in the beginning of the year. But it's important to keep them well informed. And I don't just mean in-depth trainings. I'm talking about, quote, trainings or updates on AIS problems that are currently happening in the state. Keeping your steward well informed at the launches so they can be a relay to the public and help answer questions. And if they can't, being able to forward those questions on to somebody who can. So those are just some roles that they have away from the launches, and just expanding it a little bit more than just your typical education and outreach and watercraft inspection program. So we have multiple programs across the state, all the way from Long Island, Hudson Valley, Adirondacks, Catskills, Central New York, Western. I mean, we cover a huge chunk of the state, and with the goal of covering even more in the future. Last season alone, stewards were at more than 220 locations throughout the state and completed more than 145,000 inspections. Which, if you think about it, that's no small task. So jumping into our FAQs, and Kathy and I are going to go back and forth on this. So are boat stewardship programs required by law? No. Boat stewardship programs are not required by law. They are a voluntary program. The inspections that the boat stewards do are voluntary inspections. A boater does have the right to refuse those inspections from a boat steward. But having boat steward programs is a very good idea because, like we said before, it helps reinforce that behavior and it provides a service to get inspections completed.
Okay, next one. Where does this law apply? And I get to go back to my inside joke about everywhere but your bathtub or pool. So any public waters or any waters you're launching on are probably considered public waters. So these laws apply, these regulations apply there.
So who is responsible for following through with clean, drain, and treat protocols? So ultimately, it is the recreationalist. Like I said, the boat steward program is a voluntary program. They can refuse the inspection. However, it is up to the recreationalist to do it themselves if they do not have a steward to do it.
How are public waters defined? Please don't make me read that again.
Everything.
Everything. So pretty much every water body in New York that you can think of. We'll go with that under ECL 17-0105, Section 2.
So how do you define a watercraft? So the definition of a watercraft is every motorized and non-motorized boat, vessel, or vehicle capable of being used or operated as a means of transportation or recreation on water. So you're talking about a tube, you're talking about a boat, you're talking about a seaplane. I mean, it really stretches that much.
What if my watercraft or dock is only launched or placed in one water body, does not leave the site? So relaunching. Prohibited launching without cleaning, draining, and treating shall not apply to any watercraft and associated equipment or floating dock that is relaunched from a launch site into a public water body within the bounds of any permanent barriers impassable to other watercraft. And I just wanted to mention for folks that we have a number of resources on the DEC website. We have the invasive species regulations webpage on that site. I've given you the link here, as well as a prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species tips for cleaning, draining, and treating your boat, and the signage that is required for public launches and recommended for private. And in addition, we have a webpage dedicated to aquatic invasive species boat steward programs throughout New York State, which includes a wealth of resources for funding, manuals for training stewards, and a list of the active programs, which I need to put up. We only have 2016s up right now, but list of active programs as well as additional information. So I encourage folks to make use of those resources. We also have education outreach materials, some of which are found on the Boat Steward page and others which are available upon request. Or if you have an interest in learning more about what's available, please let me know and I can get you that info. Right here we have featured some products, the Aquatic Invasive Species Tip Strip or RAC card, which is available in English, French, and Spanish. And we have a waterproof hydrilla ID card, which you've been giving out to folks in areas where hydrilla is nearby or within. And we also have a number of fact sheets that we have available for folks that are associated with web pages on the website. So all of those products are available upon request. So now we can entertain your questions. Anyone have any questions regarding the regulation or boat steward programs? That would be great to hear from you.
Thank you, Matt and Patrick, for your presentations this morning. So we're going to first go through the chat box, and we will, I'll ask you guys the questions that were submitted, and we do have some that were submitted privately as well. And so we'll go through those, and then we'll open up the floor and unmute people as they have questions. So the first question that we had was, can you explain more what it means to carry a fish in your live well? Is it just to tournaments or all together?
If you're going to a weigh-in station, I guess it would be, mostly I consider that for tournaments, but I'm guessing there are other instances where you would do that.
Yeah, I think you would have to maybe get a little bit more information, yeah, that we can then provide Brittany that she can send it back out. But as far as transporting fish in a live well, my understanding is typically for a weigh-in for a tournament. So.
Great, thank you. So then the next question was, can you talk more about temperature for motor flushing?
Why don't you do that? So temperatures for motor flushing, we say around 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Once you get up higher than that, there's some internal components that it can damage. For the external boat or external hull of the boat, it is suggested at 140 degrees. And that's not over like electronics. So it's important to, well, no, you can do 100, my fault. There's, if you want to know specifically more on where to spray certain parts of a boat, you can reach out to me individually because it's a little hard to explain through a webinar.
So the next question is, can you briefly explain how boaters might access and utilize freezing temperatures for the treatment of their boats and trailers? Thank you.
Okay, sure. Mostly what I'm thinking about is for folks who basically will clean up and store their boats outside in their driveways or in their yards over the winter. That should suffice in terms of killing off any microscopic AIS that are stuck to a hull or within a bilge at that time, because you're most likely subjecting the boat or recreational vehicle to more than 3 days of sub-freezing temperatures.
Yeah, and as far as I'm aware, there's no service that you can actually put your boat through to provide a freezing treatment during the summer.
No.
Nothing that's, and if there is, it's definitely not regulated or an approved method. So
Yes, so
we're talking winter.
Winter storage, yeah.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. So then the next question is, are there any reports of these laws or regulations actually being enforced, and has anybody been ticketed yet?
So I have heard of enforcement. I've heard of an ECO providing a ticket. I don't know exactly where. I've heard of local municipalities actually enforcing as well. I don't know specifically if a ticket was enforced. A lot of warnings have gone out. To be honest, when a steward is on duty, the practice of driving away with plants on it is fairly rare, at least in the occasion with our program. Our park police have not had to enforce. They have not witnessed it being, our regulations being broken. So we treat it as an education opportunity at first, but I don't know, do you have any more information about actually enforcement?
I have one instance where a private lake rented a floating dock from a marina on the Hudson River, and the dock arrived with zebra mussels attached to it. So an ECO was brought in and basically insisted that the supplier take the dock back and treat and decontaminate it before it was reissued for installation. And that was, she followed up on that. So that's one instance where I don't believe there was a fine, but they were forced to incur the cost of coming back out and treating that and then bringing it back out again. That's the one instance I know of with an ECO involved.
Thank you guys for answering that. So the next question to move forward is, why can't you report a license plate if you see a clear violation?
Good question. Good question. That's a tough one. Yeah.
So we can always see both ends to this story. And I can see both sides as well. As parks, we made the conscious decision of not doing specifically that because it can be trailed back to the steward. They are strictly educational for us. They are strictly educational. They're not regulatory. Like I said, we do say to, like if for some way that the steward's like, oh, this guy comes back every day, tells the park police officer, hey, this guy comes here every single day at this time. Can you be around this time so you can check it out? We try to, it's a very fine line in my eyes. And it's a practice that was instilled before I got here, and I support that idea because they are state employees, and it can be dangerous for them interacting with the public, especially in remote areas. We have as incidences of that problem of people being rude or aggressive towards stewards in remote areas where they don't have a direct supervisor there at the time. So it's just a conscious decision that we made as an agency, and it's encouraged that anyone who is developing programs to think about it as well. If you're working in a populated area where you have multiple people on at a time, where there's park staff there, or there's marina staff there, maybe that's not the best way to approach it for your individual program, but for our program, it's what makes the most sense.
I would agree, because we've also had a number of instances where stewards were not in good positions in terms of safety, and if a situation like that would also contribute to that. So unfortunately, or fortunately, however you look at it, the ECOs would need to handle that, and they would need to show up at the site and take that information instead of the stewards.
And also, as I mentioned before, within social research, there is that defined distinction between a regulatory force and cooperation, and then also an educational force and cooperation. There are two parties, and it's important to separate those two parties. If stewards are recognized as an enforcement identity, it can change social norms in a way that we might not actually want. They might think that connection to Big Brother or whatever it might be. It can be a slippery slope once you combine certain aspects of programs like this.
Thank you guys for expanding on that. I think just the short overall of that is that it's up to the discretion of each program that if they want to have stewards report it, they can, but it's up to the program coordinators. However, from an educational role, you don't want to be viewed as enforcers, which would then change the participation and acceptance of the program.
Correct.
So the next question was, somebody mentioned that they couldn't find the signs on the website and if they can guide to it. And so I can send a follow-up email when I thank everybody for joining us, and I can include that link in the email. So the next question is...
Brittany? I just wanted to mention that the link to the signs is actually on the boat steward page, which we provided the link for. Let me go back to that.
Yeah, that'd be perfect. So it's that bottom link, right?
The bottom link,
yeah. The bottom link.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Kathy.
Sure.
So the next question, it's got a little bit of an explanation with it as well. And so it says, have your lake stewards reported any poor compliance by enforcement officers in New York? Example, Marine Patrol not following the clean, drain, dry, treat method as they travel between lakes on details and thus acting as possible vectors. If so, what advice do you offer your stewards for interacting with these officers in a respectful manner?
Are you talking, so I guess clarification.
I think referring to professionals. So like Marine Patrols going between launches and not doing it, potentially fire departments and Coast Guard, I guess organizations like that.
So I can speak to our program about this. All those agencies actually cooperate very well with us. We inspect Border Patrol, we inspect fire, we inspect local sheriffs. I mean, I have never had a steward come back to me and say, oh, this agency didn't do this. As far as internally, we have set protocols for our biologists, research staff that use our parks, or any type of program that uses our launches for the prevention of spread of invasive species. And part of that is that they're required to follow these protocols. It's no question about it. So I have never come across that, actually.
And I also want to add that DEC works closely with Coast Guard and the Empire State Marine Trades Association, and they've been distributing education outreach materials throughout the state on our behalf. So they also follow these protocols and encourage people to follow them as well. And in addition, we have an internal protocol for folks in the Division of Water who are on these lakes to follow when they move from lake to lake when they're doing their research and field reconnaissance.
Thank you for expanding on that. And so, Crystal, you had been the person who submitted the question. And so something else I would offer is potentially even getting programs involved with those organizations to do like a mock training. So something like just hosting an event and working with that organization to try to get them to understand the educational side of why it's important and focus on doing those inspections as they retrieve their boats from the water. And that way, if there is some type of emergency or a situation where they're entering the water, they're not being rushed into the water and having to take that time. Okay, so the next question is, well, it's kind of mentioning of the lake associations having trouble with insurance, asking for the remedies on a statewide level, or how to get smaller lakes underneath that aren't already underneath the umbrella to get them involved who can't afford the insurance. I don't know if you guys want to touch on that question.
For boat wash stations?
So is this the liability insurance for having stewards on location?
Yeah, I think that's what it's referring to.
Okay. In some cases, we've had municipalities partner with the lake association, so it could be under their umbrella. It depends, again, on a case-by-case basis about how that's handled, because it's also related to who handles the administration of the funding, because usually it's the host agent that is doing the funding administration or the grant administration that would handle the liability insurance. So I think that's a case-by-case basis. I'd be happy to chat with people if they wanted to talk about particulars in their situation and maybe some alternatives for that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you, Kathy. And also, for those of you who haven't checked out the registration fully, next week we will be talking with a couple of organizations who kind of overcame that obstacle and how they got to that next step moving forward. So at this point, I think that we answered all of the questions in the chat box. I just wanted to check and give everybody just another minute if anyone else has any other questions they'd like to ask, or if Kathy or Matt, or if you guys would like to expand on anything further, just give it another minute or so.
Yeah, I do want to say thank you to a lot of the lake associations that are stepping up with voluntary staff and putting out these programs and on skeleton budgets and working through these issues. I know it's a huge task, and I really appreciate the fact that they're taking that risk to do it, because I know it can be daunting.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy, for bringing that up. So thank you. I just want to, I guess, take this time and thank everybody for joining us this morning. And so Kathy and Matt really went in depth about the legislation and regulations. And if you do have questions, please contact them to kind of get a little bit more involved to make sure that you have a full understanding of everything that this kind of revolves around. And so their contact information is up on the screen for the webinar right now. With that, again, thank you, Kathy and Matt, and on behalf of New York Sea Grant, thanks for joining us this morning. And I hope that you continue to be in touch while you're supporting your work and working through programs. Next week, again, I just want to mention that the program that the session will be covering a couple different programs who kind of started from the bottom and worked their way up through the different obstacles of running a watercraft inspection program and what that really means on a small scale level. And so if you guys tune in, it'll be next Thursday, October 26th at 10 a.m. And we'll be having two presenters that morning, and then a couple of minutes at the end for some different announcements for the spring. And so again, as long as there are no more questions, thank you for joining us and have a great day.
Thanks, Brittany.